Good morning and welcome to the KRUX podcast. This is the podcast that we do after a session that we've had with a speaker for anybody that couldn't be in the lounge and would still want to engage with the topic further. And I get to ask some of the questions that I couldn't ask when we had the session in the lounge. So about 2 weeks ago, we had Graham Heslop with us, and this was his first talk for KRUX. So we were so impressed that we are so looking forward to all of the other talks that he's still going to do. And Graham is a friend of KRUX. He's come to us through the channels of the Gospel Coalition Africa, and we know him from Union Chapel. And he spoke to us on the very, very important topic of friendship. So we're just going to continue the conversation a little bit more today. So Graham, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I enjoyed our time in the lounge a few weeks back as well. It was a great evening with everyone.
The talk was excellent. I was so impressed with you are clearly a person that reads a lot, and your background as a Greek lecturer too. You can see that all of your vocabulary is so informed. So I was so impressed with the quality of your talk. Thank you for your preparation. It was really great. So in the first session of your talk, you took us through some definitions of friendship, which you would think we would all just instinctively know what it is. But when I was listening to all of the different versions of how you could define it, I realized that we use these shorthand terms for everybody knows what friendship is until you make them define it. So I was wondering of all of the thousands of quotes that you brought to us and definitions, which one actually resonated the most with you? Like how do you define friendship?
Yeah, I did joke on the night about maybe having a few too many quotes in there. So I'm glad for the opportunity to pare that down. But even then, I struggled to think which ones did the best job. And the one, actually, I came to two. The first one was what I used right at the end of the talk, and it's more of a description that is found in The Lord of the Rings, and it's towards the start of the book, and Frodo is about to set off on his perilous journey, and he says to Sam, but in the hearing of Merry and Pippin, he says, it's probably best if he goes alone, just because of how dangerous and kind of that he may not come back. That's obviously a theme in the book, and Merry kind of butts in, and he says this. He says to Frodo, and I've just got it in front of me here. He says you can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin to the bitter end, and you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you can keep it yourself. But there's one thing you cannot trust us to do, and that is to let you face trouble alone, and then to go off. And this is because, Frodo, he says, and concludes, we are your friends. And I love that description because it captures at least two of the kind of things we spoke a lot about that in the lounge about friendship. And it was the thing of kind of total trust and vulnerability. This open hearts is what we spoke a lot about. And you see that there in Mary's words. But the second thing about it, and I'm sure we'll come back to this a bit later, is the idea that true friendship, it kind of perseveres to the bitter end, and refuses to let someone face troubles alone. And so I thought that's a great description. Do you want to jump in and ask me about that, or I can always then move on to the other one I wrote down here?
No, you can carry on. It's interesting that that's the one that you ended your talk with. That is the quote that most resonated with you. So even after you took us through the whole library, it was the final one, which is from a book that's so well loved at KRUX. Instead of these high thinkers, you brought us back to the fantasy narrative to find the most the best definition for friendship. So that's very interesting for me that you read all of these philosophers and yet you've come back to the fantasy story element.
Yeah, no, I mean it's I didn't say it in the talk, but and that's because I wasn't sure about the source, but and because I haven't watched it, but I'm sure someone once shared with me that in Suits, the television series drama, that there is a conversation that Lord of the Rings it comes up in, and the one, I don't know the characters' names, but the one asks the other and says, "Oh, have you read the Lord of the Rings?" And the character replies and says, "You know, of course I've read it. I've read it. I think they say 4 or 5 times." And they say that because it's a book all about power. And then the other character kind of responds to that and says, "Oh, that's strange, because I've also read it a lot of times, and I always thought it was a book about friendship." And I definitely side with the second opinion there. I think the Lord of the Rings, of course, explores the question of power or absolute power, and whether one can wield it really for good. But actually, on so many levels, I've often referred to the Lord of the Rings as a love story, in many ways, between Frodo and Sam. And that also touches on a question we'll get to later. But yeah, I think the Lord of the Rings Tolkien did a wonderful job of not defining, but describing the kind of the wonder of real rich and deep friendships. And so that is why I finished it. But if you don't mind, the second quote I did jot down there was from one of the thinkers, but again, not a high end philosopher, but St Aelred, the 12th century abbot in Revaux in France, I think. And in his book Spiritual Friendship, he says, "We call friends those with whom we have no qualm, no problem about entrusting our hearts and all their contents." And then he says, "And our friends are bound to us by that same law of loyalty and trustworthiness." And I think Aelred captures again that real rich friendships must have this place for vulnerability, for honesty, for a sharing of one's heart, as he puts it, to be able to entrust my heart to someone, and all its contents, without fear that they will turn around at some point because I've revealed something and put an end to that relationship. So yeah, those two definitions, one description, one definition, I think do the best job of defining it.
That's very good. I think I was caught out a little bit in your talk when you said maybe the weakest definition for friendship is somebody who has the same enemies as you do. So often we form our friendships on, not, "Oh, you love this thing too," but, "Oh, we both together hate this thing." And I think I was a little bit caught out on that, how political modernity has become. And one of our KRUX members, Sir Force Hofmeyer, he did a talk last year on friendship and the political, where he also made an argument for how friendship is a cure to the political. It's not that politics should lead to friendship, but that friendship should relieve the society's obsession with political. It should be a cure for the political, not the other way around. So it's so interesting how you now again also phrase that it's the heart. Do you read Lord of the Rings looking for power, to learn more about power, to learn more about friendship? And are you making friendship to gather allies, or to love? So that I like that from your talk, is constantly just looking inside the heart, even you're reaching out to forming relationships. What is the intention there? So yes, I was very caught out, which I guess, leads me to my next question. And this is a very selfish question, because I'm a deeply introvert. Human beings are exhausting to me, so it was a difficult talk for me to listen to. How you also said, it's a duty to make yourself available in friendship, as much as it is a pleasure. But then I was thinking, Proverbs 14 that says where the honor oxen, what does it crawl? What's the phrase? Oh, the trough.
That's the trough. Yeah.
Yeah, where there are no ox and the trough is clean. And then obviously the proverb goes on and says, but with people around you, there's strength. And I was thinking, why is the second part even necessary? The reward for no drama is no drama. So
No drama,
why
yeah.
can't the proverb just stop at where there are no ox and the trough is clean, done? So what could be better than a simple and clean life? What do you find in friendship that is so much more rewarding than just peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we'll come to the proverb, but I drove back from the talk with someone. Sorry,
oh, he's adorable. He can stay.
But I drove back from the talk with Jordan Pickering. He's also a friend of KRUX, and he asked a very similar question around the introvert and extroversion kind of axis, and we chatted about it a bit, and I think you give I've given the definition, and the definition is, like you say, it's a high call, it's a big demand, and then as Jordan was saying to me in the car, is that there is that's even more taxing on someone who is introverted, and so maybe part of the answer to the question, which we spoke about in the Q&A time, was how many relationships like this, how many, and I think St Aelred says no more than 4 or 5, and I think I said in the lounge, maybe even fewer. So it's not, because it is exhausting to be this close with someone, and so, but to come back to because the introversion extroversion thing is also an interesting dynamic in conversation around friendship, because myself being more extroverted, the danger for me is always the superficial. I can connect quickly. I can get you laughing. We can, have a good time. But actually, when I do, what something Wesley Hill calls like an audit of my relationships, is I often relatively, and compared to someone who's more introverted, they're maybe poorer. That is, I think in a later question, you talk about being friendly to everyone and being friends with a few, and that's and we spoke a long time about it in the Q&A. Is personal capacities is a big question here, and I think it's worth being very realistic, about your own. Your own battery, as one of my students often says, he says we all have different batteries, and that's not just a work output thing, but he's like a different relational battery, and that's something to be aware of. But then, like I say, the danger for the extrovert is the superficial. As you've highlighted, the temptation for the introvert is the withdrawal. It's the clean trough. It's to keep the oxen out of the stable. I had never heard that. I'd never heard that parable. Period. And so also I'd never heard it applied to. That proverb. I'd never heard it applied to friendship. And so as I was thinking about it on the question of the proverbs, is I really recommend, Tim Keller has preached 2 or 3 sermons on friendship from the proverbs, and they're excellent. And wherever you can find those, I don't know where you find your Tim Keller sermons, whether it's on YouTube or the Gospel in Life podcast, I think, but they're outstanding and well worth listening to. I kind of, whenever I listen to them, wish he had written more on the topic as well. But on the matter of the keeping the trough clean, keeping the oxen out, is I get that temptation, and I've encountered it, I've experienced it, and at times even I think I've expressed it myself, because if you reduce or rather, if you think about friendships aren't just a clutter, if you want to have a kind of really, the relational clutter is a real thing, right? But close relationships, and the kind that we're talking about here, are more than that. They're costly, they're demanding, and if we take Jesus' words in John 15, the friend, he says, lays down his or her life. And so, why not just avoid that? And I think, there's some great answers to that question, but there's a passage in Four Loves by C.S. Lewis, which I've written about, and he puts it typically better than I think any of us could ever dare to imagine. He says that to love is to be vulnerable, and then he says that when you love something or you love anything, he says that your heart will be wrung and your heart will possibly be broken. And then he says, so if you want to make sure to keep it intact, he says, then the best thing to do is to give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. And then he says you need to wrap your heart up carefully, wrap it around with hobbies and little luxuries, but avoid entanglements. And he says, so by doing so, lock up your heart safe. And then I think he uses two words very deliberately. He says, lock it up in a casket or a coffin. And he says, because in that casket, your heart will be safe, dark, motionless, airless, but it will change. And he says, even though it won't be broken, it will become unbreakable, impenetrable, and irredeemable. It's a very vivid, and I think very powerful, and of course very challenging quote. And like he says, there is you enter into a relationship, kind of intimate, vulnerable relationships, with that real possibility that your heart will be wrung and broken even. But I think he's right that the alternative is worse. The alternative is the heart that becomes unbreakable. And I don't know if you want to come, because I think you've asked the question, from your own experience, self-understanding. What do you think about the way he puts it?
My background is that I grew up in a Pentecostal church where, the Pentecostals don't have much understanding, I think, of introversion. And so I guess the follow-up question for that is, to what degree can a Christian have temperaments? I think one of the members of KRUX in the lounge was also asking from that point of view, because I know he's also from a Pentecostal church, and he's a leader of a small group. And I think it's very difficult, and introverts especially are very sensitive to people who are friendly, but don't know that friendly is not the same as friend. I think because the energy cost for us is so expensive, we're very suspicious of people who just seem empty friendly. But yeah, that brings me to, I think when I wasn't in a Pentecostal church, there was very little patience for, this is not the space where you're an introvert now. You have a mission, you have a gospel to share, you have needs to meet. This is now not the time to have little energy. And then I think something that was very challenging for me also in the small group structure is we were trained to be very sensitive to the idea of exclusivity and cliques forming. So whenever a small group seemed to become very tight, which is something that you would think would be encouraged, you want these lifelong deep friendships. But it seemed that the moment that the small group became cliquey, it got broken up. Like leadership would step in and they would say, okay, it's time for multiplication, everyone, let's celebrate. We're going to split the group in two, introduce new members so that it doesn't become too, closed off. And that it seemed like that's the opposite of what friendships need. Friendships need time, and they need trust, and they need loyalty. But then I'm not sure how to have friendships in church that almost I feel like the only modern sin left is the sin of exclusion. Everything else is permissible, but exclusion is the last sin. And yet, that's what friendship requires. So how is a Christian to think of exclusivity while having this mission to the world?
Yeah, it's, I mean, I've jotted some thoughts down, but I think to come back to and maybe it's a helpful, because also I discussed it in my car ride back, is to go to the gift passages, for example, and to ask if those also extend to temperament or personality, So, and Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, that we are differently gifted by God, to fulfill then quite distinct functions, and then he kind of gives the funny picture of the bodies that the parts of the body that seem more useful, more valuable, or deserving of more plaudits. He says that they should actually look at those lesser parts as being worthy of a special honor. And I think we get the gifting thing wrong. I don't think only the context you've described get it wrong, but I think we all do in different ways, whether it's to elevate the mouth, as Francis Chan often says, that the church just becomes one big mouth and it's just the preacher. And we make this mistake in lots of different ways, but perhaps what you've kind of described is that introversion itself is something quite wonderful when given the right channels to, where the people who are introverted are given the right channels to, to bless and to love others. And I've seen that. But as Susan Cain, it is her in her book Quiet, she talks about, is it the rise of the jolly likable fellow? And I think she visits Saddleback or Willow Creek, one of those two giant churches in the States, and she says basically, if you're an introvert here, there's no place for you, which leaves two options, is that people must either flip, which is even more exhausting for an introvert, or he says they must go somewhere else. And neither of those I think kind of treat people as peculiar and wonderfully made, with their own, in their own way. So maybe that is a mistake in the kind of high energy, the extrovert is best. And I think I've been on a long journey learning and thinking about that. I think it's, I've been very grateful and helped by a lot of people in thinking through that. But more to your question is this idea of the exclusive, or the clique, and the danger. And I was again looking and thinking about it, and I don't know if I quoted him in the lounge, but I think St. Jerome, he kind of writes about friendship, just kind of miscellaneous, here and there. But I think that question gets put to him, and his answer is, he says, well, you got to look at Jesus, and he says, very clearly, he at least exemplifies something of there needing to be concentric circles of responsibility and personal investment, and he has these three very dear friends, John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he's unapologetic about it. And I don't think we ever look at Jesus and go, oh, how could he, what about, what about, one of the other disciples whose names we usually can't even remember, like the other nine of them. But there is something, I think, very human about what's going on there. And it's, we could look at it and go, well, Jesus is being pragmatic. He has these three guys. They're like his key, you talk about key people in the church often, or like influence leaders. I don't think he's doing that either, because Peter is not he's not an outstanding guy. He's got his huge failings. He's not he's the one who Jesus says, on whom the rock and whom I built the church. And so it's not, again, I don't think it's a pragmatic thing that Jesus is doing here. These are, without knowing, without being able to say certainly this is what's happened, but perhaps these are just the three people who he ends up loving, or having. We talked a lot about chemistry on Thursday in the talk, is that they are maybe the three disciples he has the most chemistry with. And sure, they go on to do special things in the kingdom and receiving kind of a special place in the work of the early church. But again, it's not, like I said, there's something very human to Jesus having these three friends. I did actually jot down one of the quotes I shared about the question of cliques, and it's also in St Aelred, because he gets asked a very similar question. One of his interlocutors says, "Hey, aren't we called to show charity towards everyone?" And he's using that Latin, I think, the caritas from the from the Vulgate, and he gives this excellent answer, and he says, yes. Yes, he knows it doesn't contradict. He says, God commands that many more be received into the clasp of our charity than the embrace of friendship. And so he draws this distinction. He says that by God's law and the law of charity, he says we are ordered to welcome into and express our love towards not only our friends, but even to our enemies. And so he says that net that's as big as you can cast it realistically. But as he says, that there is this embrace of friendship, which he distinguishes from simply showing love to someone, whether they're our enemy, our friend, or somewhere in between. All of them, God commands us to work at including and welcoming into our love and our charity. But he says that there is a place for that more exclusive friendship. And yeah, do you want to come back to me, maybe ask a follow-up question to that one? Because I've gone a bit all over. But yeah.
Helpful. That's very helpful. No, I was thinking about Jesus' friendships, and I've heard a joke that, his biggest miracle isn't any of those listed in scripture. The biggest miracle is that he could have 12 close friends in his 30s. And I was thinking that is so true. Like being 30 years old and, having such a wide friendship circle, how impossible does that seem to us today? So that's why I was thinking of asking you, children would very rarely have a conversation like you and I are having. If you do find a child that is struggling to make friendships, that's usually all alarms ringing, something is very, very wrong. And then somewhere along the line, we just get used to, children have friends and adults don't. This is how it is. But I don't remember a special birthday when somebody said, okay, good luck, now you're 25, you won't make new friends from here. So what happens? Why do we lose that? Why is it so easy for children and it's so difficult for adults? What happens to us as we grow up?
Yeah, it's a great question, because, and it's one I'd not also not considered, not been asked before, and it gave me thinking. Is and like you say, the child who struggles to make friends is usually, there's cause for concern there, kind of a social, developmental problem perhaps. But I think, and I did mention this the talk where I mentioned some of the obstacles to friendship. I think a big one for children, relative to adults, is that they are not upwardly mobile, and children are very much you're thrown into the same place, whether that's preschool, primary, all the way through to high school, and you are thrust together, and you kind of, in some ways, you make friends there, you sink or swim, and unfortunately, a lot of, or most kids end up, making these friends who often stick with them throughout school, and often even across schools, as you move up together. But in some ways, you said there's no birthday, but at 18, for a lot of us, there is then often a move. We relocate, and I don't know if we ever then do the hard work of asking what exactly we have, with those friends, which is something I really encouraged in the talk that you should be working towards doing, is these very open conversations. Wesley Hill calls them audits of our relationships. To what is it we have? Is this something we want? And what are we willing to do to make sure that it perseveres, or in Mary's words, that it lasts to the bitter end, through the trouble, through the peril. One of those things being apart, being long distance friends, for example. And so there is the mobility thing is a big factor. And maybe this is different today, but I stayed in the same suburb until I was 22. There was one all boys school there, and so I'd spent 5 years there, and that, because it was the only all boys school, most of the close friends I'd known in primary, moved up with me. And so that just carried on. But maybe on the other side of it, is I wondered if children aren't more forgiving, on some levels, but more than that, I think in many cases children haven't yet been, or at least a lot of children haven't yet been very seriously hurt by broken trust and broken relationships. That is, they haven't yet developed a suspicion towards others, who, maybe they are pretending, maybe they are using me. There is in many ways you want to talk about an innocence, and I wouldn't call it a naivety, but rather there is a wonderful kind of trust that you often see among smaller people, which we lose with time, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, as we grow more cynical, more jaded with age, but also as we get hurt by people who are close to us. Like, to go back to that Lewis quote, he says that the heart can be broken, and that's not only in romance, that's in all sorts of places, and it's very hard to get back up from that, and as he says, to make it available again for the same thing to happen. And so I wonder if it's, as we get older, and the knocks that we start to take actually, as you've put it, also just maybe cause us to be a little more careful and withdrawn. And we want to preserve ourselves, spare ourselves the hurt that's very, very possible, as Lewis says, and in most cases, sadly, probable, at least in the case of some friendships. I think I'll say one more thing here, because I did write down a few points. I'm definitely going to go and write a blog post about this question. So thank you for it, Leishan. I think in most cases, also children aren't competing or vying for position, and that is something that, as we grow up, does sadly also seems to become inevitable. Is that people are no longer my colleagues, my friends. They're actually they become my opponents. Right. I think John Webster puts it very well in one of his outstanding theological essays. John Webster is a theologian of the highest order, if anyone wants to know. Not the playwright who wrote The Duchess of Malfi. I haven't actually read that John Webster, but John Webster kind of says that he says that my neighbor, until I'm liberated by the gospel to love them, he says my neighbor is always, at the very least, my my competitor, and at the worst, they are my enemy to my own flourishing. And he says that it's only the gospel that can really flip that around, so that I can actually perceive someone now not to be against me, even if they are against me, but I'm not in competition with them anymore, because I have a better, surer identity, and it's not found in my ability to climb above them, to defeat them, in any of the ways that adults like to to compete with and defeat one another. So that's I think, and I'll say, sorry, I've gone on here. I'll say one more thing, is I quoted Nietzsche a lot in the talk, and that's because he strangely has a lot to say about friendship and one of the reasons, as I've kind of read his a biography on him, is that he was a terribly lonely man, and his perspective on friendship is very bleak. His outlook is very bleak, and I think it's because of a lot of his philosophy at that point is quite autobiographical. It's he can't envision something wonderful because he's never had it. But he says a few things, and obviously for Nietzsche, if we want to tie some threads together, it's always about power. And he makes a great point about love and respect, or love and power. And he says that one of the reasons we don't see, and he kind of hones in on men here, and I think he's right. He says one of the reasons we don't see very close, intimate and vulnerable relationships between men is because men are always vying for the respect of one another and of other people. And then Nietzsche, he so often is just, he has a kind of remarkably prescient understanding of human nature. And he says, and so rarely do we find respect and love for the same person. And he says, but given the choice, most men, and I'm picking on men here, but most men, he says, will pick respect over love. And I think that's because it feeds some more kind of darker sides of who we are. I'd much rather be in authority over someone than, which I think Jesus illustrates and demands so often, is that I actually subject myself to someone in love. To bring that all back, I think children aren't seeing each other as someone who they have to compete with, overcome, but very often as someone who is a kind of wonderful equal, even if they haven't understood maybe the demands of that costly love, or but at the very least, I don't need to better them when I'm 9 or 8, 12 even. I don't know when it happens. I don't know where the line is that you said, but that there's definitely another line there.
That helps a lot. It also gives greater context to, I presented at KRUX earlier this year. One of my students did her research project for the year in applied mathematics. She wanted to look at a game theoretical analysis of the Sermon on the Mount. And she specifically wanted to see if she could quantify a payout, which is the net between the cost of ego depletion, like laying down your ego and how much that hurts, and then pro-sociality, which is the gain of friendship. And what she found at the end was, through correlation coefficients and interviews and sociological tests, try and gauge how human beings rate the pleasure of ego and the pleasure of friendship. And if you have to weigh laying down the one to get the other, the friendship has to supply about twice the pleasure that you get from your own ego to entice you to choose friendship over ego. So it's about twice. And you're now giving me an idea. Maybe we should repeat that study, do those tests and the correlation coefficients with children, and see if that twice actually comes down. And maybe there's something there. Maybe that's also why scripture says, unless we see the world as children see it, our neuroticism is is going to steal from us. So that's very helpful. Thank you. That really puts also our study into context for me. That there might be something here.
That does sound like a fascinating piece of research, actually. Wow.
Yeah, the talk for it is on the KRUX channel if you want to go to it.
Yes.
It's such a great job. It was such an interesting insight. As she was trying to make a mathematical case for why we should live according to the Sermon on the Mount. So very, very interesting. I think you were talking about Lord of the Rings, and when you mentioned it in the lounge, there is always such a sigh of affection for the piece, and you were talking about David and Jonathan, and so because KRUX is so deeply rooted in the arts and in the narrative and in storytelling, we're very, very sensitive to any reference to myth or storytelling or narrative. So we were really enjoying the examples, Ruth and Naomi that you mentioned of friendship, and I'm glad we touched on it, and I'd like to touch on it again here, is something that drives me bananas, is this obsession that we have with homosexualizing friendships from literature and history. And I don't understand it. Why is culture so intent on insisting that the only legitimate intimate same-sex relationship must be homosexual in nature? It must be sexually active, romantic. Why in modernity can two people of the same gender not just be friends? What is behind our obsession with this?
And we spoke about it a lot after the talk, and I think a bit in the talk, and I share your frustration. I think I relayed a story that watching Lord of the Rings, with some friends, and towards the end, of the films, which are great in their own right. There is that real affection between Sam and Frodo, kind of on the slopes of Mount Doom, and whether they're on their way up or they're lying there waiting, in their minds to die, and it's very tender, it's very beautiful, and I remember watching it. And someone just kind of shouting up, like this, look at these two, it's so gay, and I kind of, that's always was definitely a hook in me, because I went away and I've never forgotten it, and I've spoken about it, when I've preached on friendship, I've often led with that as a why can't, or in the Middle Earth, in Tolkien's broader creation, it's Legolas and Gimli, Legolas, forsakes sailing to undying lands to venture through Middle Earth with Gimli. It's again something that I think Tolkien deliberately writes into his stories, because he tasted it, with the Inklings, with Lewis, Greaves and other people in that friendship circle, and again there are some valid criticisms of it, of Lewis and of Tolkien, and I've made a few, but I'm not going to do it now because I think on the one hand it's a vision we've lost, and it's a vision that's, you're right, it's become confused with, particularly you have a kind of what I call a kind of revisionist reading of older works, whether it's David Jonathan, Lord of the Rings, another book that I think shows a very strong relationship between two young boys, is Chaim Potok. He's a trilogy, and also people have come down and said, oh look, there's something else going on here. And I think Wesley Hill has the best short answer, and I did quote him in his book Spiritual Friendship. He says that the modern age is plagued by what he calls the Freudian myth, and he says it's this hyper-sexualized view of the self and the identity, and so that what must be happening in any real close intimacy, and this isn't only between two people of the same sex, but even in the case of mixed sex friendships, which if we have time maybe we will touch on, but but he says that there is the suspicion, the presupposition rather, that if two people are so close, it must be driven by some kind of sex drive. That would take us to Freud, or that it is at least romantically interested or geared. That, and I don't have a good kind of simple short answer to the question. I think Wesley Hill touched on something. I think the recent works of Carl Trueman, Rise and Triumph, and the shorter book they did, The Strange New World, where he talks about the influence of thinkers, particularly Freud, amongst others, of how we have come to fundamentally different view of the self and the person. And so, in following in the train or the thought of Freud, as he says that, the person is only ever sexual, any kind of frustration to that is bad, but also our outlook and desires are also always at least have an undertone of romance or sexual intimacy. I've thought about it. Maybe I gave a better answer on Thursday night, but yeah, for example, I've always kind of chuckle, with the David Jonathan story is you have kind of scholars trying to do two things with the story. On the one hand, you have people saying, oh, it's not as close as it appears. Actually, just some kind of covenantal commitment that Jonathan makes to the cause of the Davidic king. So you have this reading, which is this uneasiness around what they seem to, this real rich love that they have for each other. And then on the other side, you have the other revisionist approach is saying, oh, it's actually just it's a homosexual relationship, and it's kind of been coded, but in a subtle way, because you couldn't, that was unthinkable at the time. And there's an arrogance there that assumes that we're better readers of the Old Testament than ancient Hebrews might have been, which I think is wrong. That we are, well, what are we, 2,800 years later, we're like, well, if we apply our tools, we can actually see something that the Hebrew who thought and wrote and understood the world in this kind of way, they missed something that we got. And so but it's funny, you have that other extreme, both are resisting close friendship. The other extreme is saying, oh no, it's this Davidic cause, it's the promise God made to David. Jonathan's kind of getting on the winning side. He's on the side of Yahweh. He wants to be with David, but there's nothing kind of intimate there. And I would kind of reject both and say, maybe to do a third way, the kind of thing is, but no, it doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. Why is it not simply as David, I forget who says it, but he loved him as his own soul, quoting or alluding to Deuteronomy, or he'll say in 2 Samuel 1, his love was exquisite. Why? So I'm more just asking your question again, is why have we've taken words like exquisite, with relative to love or intimacy, vulnerability, and I made a case to try and buy back the word chemistry between people, which Lewis does in Four Loves, that these can be shared between close friends. These are not only the position of the romantic, but also just the friend who loves and is loved. And so I think maybe you, in some ways, you answered the question in asking it, and I've just prattled on and riffed on that. Is that it's how we've come to see the self has radically altered how we view everything, and particularly relationships. Is that there must be something more repressed or veiled, but there can't be love that is non-sexual. That's the short answer. Yeah.
And it's interesting how it infiltrates our vocabulary, because even as a Christian, I would also talk about a bromance, when I see two male friends, and it's such a loaded word. Or I would also say, if I'm really interested in being friends with another woman, I'll call her my girl crush, and these are all vocabulary that I picked up from I'm permanently online, and I'm thinking, be careful my own vocabulary to reinforce these ideas that I can't just be friends with a woman, I must have a girl crush. That's everything. But then at the same time, we're just as suspicious of friendships between the opposite sex. Like, we are very that's another bugbear that I have is my godson is 3. And, he has a little friend at his play school, and immediately people are calling this 3-year-old his girlfriend. And I'm thinking, why do we do this? Why can't my godson just have a little friend? Why must it be, and it's already planned, what age do we start dating? And I'm thinking it's so much pressure. And I spoke about this in the lounge. To go back to what you said now, men generally, want respect, and women generally want love. We want different things. And from what I've read, if you look just also at gendered psychology, is men seem to be more object orientated. So it seems like to me that men make friendships by both looking towards a third thing, and they're standing next to each other looking towards a third thing, while women make friendships while looking at each other. They turn to gaze at each other, and in that the intimacy is. And so I guess I even wonder, how possible is it for a man that wants to gaze forward at a third thing to build friendship, and a woman that wants to gaze at each other? How compatible is that even? So how that, I want to thank you for that. Also, your talk, the culmination of your talk is that when a Christian is faced with a false dichotomy that forces us into either it's impossible to have same-sex friendships or opposite-sex friendships, or everyone should have one. You said God always offers a better, higher third option, and the glory of man is to seek out what is God's higher, better option. I thank you so much for that. That also came out in Jonathan last week. I keep on bringing that up. And what is this higher, better option to think about male-female friendships, from the Christian point of view, so that we don't make the mistake of also over-sexualizing everything, but we don't also make the mistake of naively just thinking, entering into dangerous relationships.
Firstly, credit must go to Chris Watkin for the wording you've used there is the higher, better way that refuses the false dichotomy. That's Biblical Critical Theory, which is a book I highly recommend. I think I tried to give it a punt in the lounge too. It's an excellent work, and a very necessary one in the increasingly polarized time we live in. Him trying to show how God often gives us, what does, I think he quotes G.K. Chesterton is the choices in between mercy and justice, but both of them glowing as brightly as possible, and together kind of shedding this even better light. So, sorry, that's just a Chris Watkin, in case he's listening, but this question, and I was surprised I think it took 4 or 5 questions in the lounge before we got to it, is often the first one that comes up, and people are often will start by saying, the language that I've used, or St Aelred, again, St Aelred's in a monastery, and so the question of mixed sex friendship is not actually for him. It's an all men monastery, and so and then this question ends up consuming the. So I'm glad it's also come late here, and not for us to start with it. And I think you've again outlined the challenge. There's more challenges than the one you've mentioned. There is the Freudian myth, that the that the telos of any relationship, that a close, intimate relationship I might have with a woman, is always the bedroom. That's, I think, to put it like that, is that has to be the trajectory, because, well, thinkers like Freud, is there something going on that I'm not being honest about? But then you're right, there is the other extreme, there is the danger, and that's where we spoke a lot about the need for discernment and wisdom, and even, an unpopular word today in the church, something like accountability. There is this, and that's where strong friendships again can really help and strengthen us, and as we try to follow Christ together. But I think I quoted Kathy Keller on the and she, in her and Tim's book on the meaning of marriage, she just has it's almost like a throwaway, and I've written it down and I've often come back to it. And she says that if you look at how God made us, Genesis 1 verse 27, he made us male and female in the image of God, he created them, there, and I think starting there, again, not such a popular word today, but there is this complementarity, between the sexes, a binary, just getting all the, all the words to get me in trouble out off the table here. And that's there, and
monetize.
Yeah. And we, I think, and Kathy Keller goes on to say that we deny that in friendship. So we see it in so many places. We go, God has made us different, and there's so much to be gained from recognizing and embracing rather than denying that. It's an important word for today. But then she says, but yet we come to friendship, and the suspicion kind of it undercuts the potential, and so ever since doing my master's research, I've made a point of trying to avoid the word tension, but there is inevitably this tension here between around the friendship that could become romantically entangled. And I think that's always something kind of worth remembering, is that it could happen, but a mistake to say that it is inevitable. And when I've wanted to be a little more contrarian, perhaps, or get push people, I've often said that I have chemistry with more than one woman, and by which I mean that chemistry is not an exclusively romantic thing. Again, in Four Loves, Lewis talks about that wonderful moment, where suddenly you look at someone else, and what he says, how does he put it? What, you two, I thought I was the only one. And there's, and then he goes on to describe it in that passage by saying that this is akin to, and in some cases, he says, perhaps even more profound than that moment of falling in love. And again, people might want to push back against Lewis. I'm not going to say yay or nay, but there is, that happens between friends, and we think love at first sight only happens between mates. And so depending on where I've given this talk, I've always been very careful, and I often, I think not the last time I preached it, but the time before, I remember someone asked the question, and the first thing I had to do was look, and I tried to make eye contact with one of the elders in the church, just to get a sense of how he wanted me to, to answer that question, respecting, what they would teach there. But there's, again, maybe I can provide some, like a bibliography of sorts and some articles, but I do, there's a quote I've used before. I think Timothy George quotes Luther, and Luther, who often had these really great kind of throwaway lines, and one of them was, he said, I can't stop birds flying over my head, but I can stop them from making nests in my hair. And just to kind of, and what he's doing in that quote is he's actually talking about the dangers of legalism and kind of licentiousness, that old, that axis. And he's the answer to, if Luther doesn't mind me kind of riffing on his analogy, it's not to go outside with my shotgun and to shoot all the birds that I see flying for fear that they're going to come and nest in my hair, but also to be aware that this is still something that could happen. And that's why tension. I don't like the word, and I'm not wild about the answer, but I do think it's to recognize the possibility, but not the inevitability of romance developing. But at the same time, to not think we have to choose avoidance of that, but rather to embrace that kind of the wonderful way that God has made us for each other. And I've often remarked more than once is that, and I said it on Thursday night, is that friendship is often treated like the waiting room for marriage. And this applies not only to, mixed sex, but often, sadly, even same-sex friendships, is that, you have all these friends and then suddenly a romantic interest develops and there's a slow extraction, which is then underlined at the wedding. And there's a great poem or a column piece by someone called Carrie English. It's called The Bridemaid's Lament. And again, like I said, I can provide links to all these things, but she looks at, she's getting married with her well, not getting married, sorry, one of her best friends is getting married, and she really does lament what the not just the declaration, the public kind of covenantal binding of love, but she says that there is almost always with that, whether it's explicitly stated or just kind of implied, that this is now, the collateral is going to be everyone else. That's, I don't think that's how we should see friendships. Linked with that is often you have, again, I've often said is that I can have the kind of unstated opinion, or view is that I can have lots of female friends, and we can be, close at various degrees, but at the moment I get married, those need to, and you got to ask, well, why, what is the reason there? Is it, can I not have both? Must I now choose a spouse or a close female friend? And again, to come all the way back to Kathy Keller, as I think it's a mistake to go, well, no, because we're not just, our complementarity extends way beyond sexual complementarity between, men and women, but it's like you've said, is there is we are built and made different. And there's a wonderful kind of richness about experiencing that together, that is not necessarily needed to be romantic. I don't know if that's answered the question. We went all over there.
Thank you. It's helping me shape my thoughts, because the latest KRUX newsletter is almost due, and I'm trying to write a piece on being a slave to technique. Isolating. Yes, and then what the application of technique does to humanity. And I think, because my background is also in science, I'm always looking for the technique, and I'm so grateful for the KRUX community constantly bringing me back and saying, all right, but you require wisdom, and there's no technique to wisdom. There is love and relationship with God and fear of God. And so I can feel the KRUX Lounge keeping me human as I'm fiercely, pursuing technique and method. So this is, again, it's such a moment for me, is you're not going to give me a rule for my relationships. Stop pursuing technique. And I'm going to try and include that in my newsletter post. So thank you so much. It's very, very helpful. It's really helping me shape my thoughts around what it means to be human and to have relationships as a human. I think maybe to wrap up, I don't know, what advice do you now have for a very deeply lonely adult listening to this, thinking, yes, we can wax lyrically about the definitions and how great it is to have friendships, but what if somebody, you from the Eastern Cape, and I'm sure your move to the Western Cape has been quite a shock. I know some of our KRUX members from the Eastern Cape, that's one of the first things they say is just, what is wrong with this province? Like, why are people so closed off? So what advice do you have for deeply lonely, maybe Eastern Capers that have just arrived in the Western Cape, or any other adult that is yearning for friendship and doesn't even know where to begin?
Yeah. So I'm actually from the second most friendly city, and that's Durban, not Port Elizabeth. Port Elizabeth is the friendly city. Hey, but so the East Coast, and I can concur with that kind of experience that you've just described. And a lot of people who come to the Western Cape, that is, and part of that, funny enough, to come way back to something we discussed earlier, is that there are often very well established cliques, and they're very difficult to break into. But I'll keep this one short because some answers have been so long. As I thought about this question, I wondered if talking about friendship and the implementation of it is in some ways, and I'll hopefully tie this analogy together, is some ways a bit like prayer, and in the sense that we don't really think it's something we need to be helped or taught how to do. Despite the disciples literally coming to Jesus in Matthew 6 and saying, "Hey, can you teach us how to pray?" So there's that principle there. But and you said it right at the start, is friendship is an assumed thing, and when you start to peel back the layers, then you see what you've got, and it's maybe not exactly what you look like on the outside. So I do really advocate for reading and thinking a bit about friendship, because there are so many counterfeits, so many shadows. We kind of revel in our own superficial versions of it, and like you've said, we begin to think that that's the real thing, but it's really not. And so I would kind of say there's lots of great resources out there, kind of from popular level down to these serious studies that have been done, and then older and newer as well. So, more contemporary and keyed kind of for relevance, and then more like principally driven, which I think Aelred's book is, for example. I recently gave a copy of Aelred to a friend, with the purpose of reading it with him, so that I do really advocate for casting your eye around your ear. Those Tim Keller sermons are, again, outstanding. But I'll finish by saying that is maybe two things, both which I said towards the end of my talk, and it's something Wesley Hill says in the kind of the last chapter of his book, Spiritual Friendship, is he says you do have to at some point look at what you have, and you have to then ask yourself, what is this? What could it be? What do I want for it? And what am I willing to give to it? And look, the person who comes back from that and says, I don't have anything, that's a very difficult situation. I mean, I think again, and I hope it's not kind of trite, the answer there is, Ratlak Holmes, who's written on friendship more recently, he looks at the Christian community and he says it is the platform on which to go deeper. And so maybe it is a small group, as you've mentioned, or a discipleship, mentorship, something like that. But that you don't stop there, actually, that you pursue that more wonderful embrace that Aelred talks about. So that's, look at what you have, look at what you could maybe get. But then, and this is what I still have to think a lot about myself, is then to go take that to the person, and then to discuss that relationship together, because the extensive picture vision that I've offered, and even the definitions, they turn on not complete reciprocal kind of nature, but there has to be an agreed upon, and that's where I talked about covenant, or promises, a joining of and committing to one another. I think, and I'll finish with this. Sorry, that wonderful quote that I just took from Wesley Hill in his book, and he says that it's not you're mine because I love you. He says that's often how we think about friendships, is that as long as I keep up this thing, then we have each other. But he says really what we should be pursuing and make our ambition is to be able to say to someone, I love you because you're mine. And that's but I mean, again, you couldn't put it better, but how can I say it about someone else that they're mine? There needs to be some, there needs to be I don't want to say terms, because there's no contract, but there needs to be an agreement, to have the same mind, to maybe pull something that Paul says in Philippians, for example, about the same thing, that we now are committing to one another in this relationship that we want to endeavor at, to deepen, and to delight in, for our lives. Yeah. So that's the answer.
That's lovely. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you and to hear from you. We are so looking forward to your post that will then be on the KRUX blog. So please know that you have an open invitation to the lounge anytime there's something on your heart. We are interested in anything that you are interested in. We want to hear about it and learn from you. So thank you so much for all the time, that you've given to KRUX Now. You drove through all that way with Jordan. Thank you, Jordan, for also driving with you, being a good friend on the road. So, if anybody stumbled upon this recording or was sent this recording by a friend, and you keep hearing me say KRUX, what the heck is KRUX? We are a community for Christian formation. We're based in the Western Cape and the Winelands. And we are artists and philosophers and writers and filmmakers and theologians and cultural analysts and political pundits. We get together and we talk about whatever is happening culturally in the art world, in our thought world, in our faith world. And we'd love to hear from you and have you join in the lounge. You can find out about our community. Our website is krux.africa. So it's KRUX.Africa. Or you can email me directly, lishan@krux.africa. And while you wait for Graham's blog post to be published, you can go read all of the existing blog posts that are already there about topics that we spoke about in the past. Otherwise, you can just navigate through our YouTube channel for other recordings of podcasts from previous talks. And lots more talks to follow this year. We will have our year-end function that we do for Thanksgiving. And Graham, you must know you are definitely invited to Thanksgiving. So I hope we do see you then. I hope we do see you in the lounge again.
I hope so too. Well, I plan to, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Lishan. I've really enjoyed this time as well. So thank you. It's been your great questions, and definitely given me more to go away and think about. There's very few definitive answers, I think, around a lot of these things, and actually just a lot of space for us to think and develop. So thank you. Thank you for the call.
Big pleasure. See you then in the lounge.
All right. Bye bye.